Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity, and may the 4th be with you. I'm here to review Star Wars Episode 6, The Return of the Jedi. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review a Star Wars movie every year for May the 4th, which I believe is a holiday for what I understand is kind of falling out of some favor. So maybe by the time I keep doing these, no one will care about it anymore. But I don't know. I'm still committed to this, and maybe some people still make a big deal out of it. They still play Star Wars music at my work on this day. Anyway, I had covered in the previous 2 years A New Hope and then The Empire Strikes Back, so now I'm here to cover Return of the Jedi. Now, in my review of The Empire Strikes Back, I stated that I feel like The Empire Strikes Back was the only truly great Star Wars movie ever made. And that overall the Star Wars franchise is a little overrated. Which I know, I'm a Star Trek fan. I'm a Star Trek guy, always been. More so than the Star Wars. But you know, if people like Star Wars better, that's fine. I'm just here to state my opinion, and in my opinion, the Empire Strikes Back is where the saga peaked, and it never really got the same. Now, I do think that the saga is now transformed and is more taking a different form in TV format, which I believe is grown out of the original trilogies, but become something quite different. I had just watched The Clone Wars, I'm about to watch Rebels, and of course I've seen The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett. And I'm really liking the TV direction they're going in. And of course Obi-Wan's going to come out later this month, which I'm really anticipating as well. So I like the new direction that the saga is taking, and I think this is a better direction because obviously with the sequel trilogy we see that there's no longer fit for the movie format. Although we still will, of course, get some movies, but maybe more like Star Wars stories like Rogue One and Solo, which were okay. So it's taking on this different format, but as far as like classic movies go, I think The Empire Strikes Back was the only really great one of the saga. Now, I talked about in A New Hope that I didn't really care for that movie, and I never did growing up, to be honest. I mean, I was born after it was released. I know a lot of people were now. But I was alive when Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi were released, although I was too young to remember either of them, although I have very vague memories of Return of the Jedi. The main thing I would just remember is Ewoks. And buying all the Ewok toys and playing with the Ewoks and going to see the Ewoks, and when the Ewok TV movies came out, being so excited about them. I was right around the target audience for the Ewoks anyway. But I never really had the attachment to A New Hope. And when I was growing up, it was my least favorite of the trilogy. I really, really got into... of course I was a fan during the 80s when I was a kid. I would play with the toys and whatnot. But when I really... understood the movies and really got into them was in the early 90s when I was like 10, 11, 12. And what the two movies I loved were The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. New Hope was, that was just, to me, that was an inferior film. That was okay, which I already covered in my review of The New Hope. That was just my perspective. I know not a lot of people agree, but that's what I had. But when I was growing up, when I was in that age, preteens, into my teens, I would always go back and forth on which Star Wars movie I liked better, Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi. There was certain stages in my life I would consider Return of the Jedi, my favorite Star Wars film. But as I had just stated, and I stated in earlier videos, I now, as an adult who analyzes fiction and story structure and stuff like that, and learning all the backstory involved in the creation of these films, I am of the let's say learned opinion that The Empire Strikes Back is the best, clearly the best, and in fact only truly great film. But where does that leave my opinion on Return of the Jedi? Well, I still like Return of the Jedi a lot. And I still like it more than A New Hope, and I dare say I like it more than any other Star Wars film. Revenge of the Sith comes close, and even, pardon the rocks that are going to be thrown at me, but even The Last Jedi for me comes close. But I don't think, if you look at the original trilogy as a whole, particularly these two films, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, none of the prequel or sequel trilogy films touch it. I know there's a lot of times where I have said repeatedly that Revenge of the Sith is my second favorite Star Wars film, but I think the more I look on it, the more I see I can't really say a prequel is better than Return of the Jedi. I will say that a prequel is better than A New Hope. As I said, I was never that much into it. But, I would have to say Return of the Jedi is probably my second favorite Star Wars film. But it is, to me, it is inferior to Empire in many ways. And a lot of it I learned, the more I learned about the creation of it and the behind-the-scenes stuff, it has to do with that. And the main thing, and this is, I guess, one of the things I'll address first and head on, is the Ewoks. Now, interestingly enough, this was Lucas's sort of decision after some of the backlash of The Empire Strikes Back being too dark and not family friendly, and apparently he agreed with this criticism, or at least took it to heart. And so he set out to make the last Star Wars film a lot more uplifting, more inspiring, and more family friendly. That's, he purposely set out to make it more family friendly and appeal to kids. I mean, the cynic in you can of course say this is so you could sell toys, because of course the Ewoks were huge at selling toys, but really, I mean, honestly, any of the Star Wars stuff would have sold lots of toys. But Ewoks were definitely more kid friendly, but I personally believe this came out of more of a desire for Lucas to make the Star Wars trilogy more kid friendly, something that definitely comes up in the prequels, which we will get to. I'll actually get to that next year, starting on the good old prequels. But anyway, and apparently he had butt heads with Lawrence Kasdan a lot over this, who wanted to take the last Star Wars film, continue on the direction Empire Strikes Back started, a more darker or more adult themed way. And some of these ideas that I heard Lawrence Kasdan came up with, I also disagree with, because he wanted to do stuff like kill Luke, and then he tried to convince Lucas to kill someone, and when he said it wouldn't be kill Luke or kill Han Solo or kill Leia, and Lucas was very resistant and insisted that this was going to be uplifting, happy movie. No one was going to die, but eventually they agreed on Yoda, but of course the stipulation is that Yoda wouldn't die in battle, but of old age. Which, yeah, I think that scene always came out of nowhere for me. It seemed to get a bit out of place, Yoda's death, but I'll talk more about that later. Anyway, so, and something I talked about in my previous covers of the previous two films is that Lucas had a, shall we say, dispute with the filming guilds, and was basically kicked out, and because he refused to put the credit, casting list at the start of the film in Empire Strikes Back. and so he was kind of kicked out, and so that restricted a lot of people who could work with it. Restricted funding, it restricted a lot of things. And it's interesting hearing the behind the scenes of Return of the Jedi, because apparently they had relative to a huge blockbuster like this, a relatively restrictive budget, and they didn't have and this is almost like an independent film with just 20th Century Fox kind of lending support, but not like fully funding it. The way he did the first Star Wars film, and that's he did Empire Strikes Back that way too, which is what gave him greater independence from the studio, so he wouldn't have to bow to the studio input, and so he did that again with Return of the Jedi. But in this case, he also had a restriction of not being able to work with anyone involved with the Guild, which restricted him greatly. In fact, his original idea was to have Steven Spielberg direct this film, and I honestly, sincerely believe that had Spielberg directed this film, it would have been much better. I really believe that, and that's just speculation on my part, but I think that's the case. And so, but because of that, he couldn't work with Spielberg, and many Hollywood directors he couldn't work with. He had to go to a unknown European director to direct this film, who had pretty much no experience with a big budget blockbuster like this. And I think that shows a bit. I think the film could have been better constructed had they not had to resort to issues like that. And the funny thing that I remember hearing is that when they were filming on location, they had, I think, Blue Harvest is what they called the film, because they didn't want people to know they were filming Star Wars, because everyone would try to, seek as much money out of them as possible, because as far as they know, Star Wars is a huge billion-dollar blockbuster, and they had just, oozing money everywhere, but in fact, their budget was really restrictive, so they didn't want people to know they were filming Star Wars, which I think is kind of funny. So another thing I talked about in my last review is when he made The Empire Strikes Back, it was totally his intention to do 9 Star Wars films. In fact, he's quoted as saying that he could be making Star Wars films every 3 years for the next 21 years. But his idea was that he wouldn't be heavily involved in every Star Wars film. He would just be the creative mind behind it, and other people would produce and direct it. But when we got to this film, when he started making Return of the Jedi, he completely scrapped that idea, because partly, as I said, he got kicked out of the Guild and stuff like that, so he didn't have access to skilled Hollywood directors and producers who would be able to pull something off like this. And as he found in this film, his original idea was to, in fact, step back and let others do it. But because he had a director that was not as experienced with these kind of blockbusters, he needed to step in and be involved way more than he wanted to. And so which is why he decided that when making this film, it would be the last Star Wars film. In fact, during this time period, he's quoted as saying that he does not want to be making Star Wars films for the rest of his life. So it was a drastic change over the 3 years, a lot having to do with personal issues. There's accounts, and of course we don't know for sure, but accounts that his heavily involvement in this film and hardly being at home is what heavily contributed to him getting divorced. And so it had consequences for his personal life. In fact, when he came back to the prequels back in '99, he's quoted as saying that he needed that time for his family, but now that his kids were grown up, he could return to Star Wars finally. But this was kind of, this was his original idea was, of course, to let others do Star Wars, but when that was impractical, which he found in this film that he actually needed to be involved, he's like, I can't keep doing this, so this is going to be the last Star Wars, at least for a good long while. And so that affected the story a bit, because the main thing I feel is effective was the line in Empire Strikes Back where Yoda says, "There's another Skywalker." Now, there's some indication, and some sources I've read that state that this other Skywalker was intended to be Luke's sister, yes, but it was intended not to be Leia, but a different character who was going to be featured prominently in episodes 7, 8, and 9. However, that because that was his intention when he was making Empire Strikes Back. But when it came to Return of the Jedi, he knew he wasn't going to be making that episode. In fact, he completely scrapped the idea of doing 7, 8, and 9. Even when they were making the prequels in the 2000s, he had no intention of doing so. So this character was not going to exist anymore, and so they had already set up this, setup for it, where they said, hey, there's another Skywalker, and a lot of fans latched onto it. In fact, it's noted that Lucas said this was the number one question he was asked by fans before Return of the Jedi came out. And so they did need to resolve it, and so they pivoted to the only other female main character in the whole cast, and that's Princess Leia. Now, honestly, because there were some accounts earlier that tried to insist that this was his plan from the very beginning to make Leia Luke's sister, but I think that's clearly not the case. In fact, I can tell by watching these three films that was clearly not their intention. In fact, the most obvious one that's obvious to anyone is when they were building up a romance between them in the first film, and she actually kissed him in the second film. And so I think it's very clear that they did not know that Leia was Luke's sister, and this is something they just had to because they had set up for something that they ended up not doing, and so they had to resolve it in some way. So they said, let's just make it Leia. And honestly, this comes off as really sloppy to me, especially, as a kid, I didn't question it, didn't care because I was a kid, whatever, but looking at it now as an adult with an analytical eye, it does come off as really sloppy, and that is clearly was not their intention to begin with. And in fact, I don't think it really is necessary. It doesn't really have any payoff to it. The only reason it exists is so they can answer that question that Yoda asks in the Empire Strikes Back if there's another Skywalker. They needed to resolve it. So there, it's resolved. It's Leia. But it doesn't serve any story-serving purpose whatsoever. And so I believe if they knew from the beginning that there were going to be no episodes 7, 8, 9, that the Return would be the last Star Wars film for a good long while, they never would have put that line in there. But they did, and so they're like, okay, let's just resolve it. There we go, line's resolved. But it serves no storytelling purpose, and I would argue it's a bit silly that these two characters who just happen to meet each other just happen to be brother and sister. It's the kind of serendipity that I really, don't like in films, and is obvious it's just there for plot convenience. Now, and I feel like they never really paid off on Leia being a Skywalker. Really. In this film, they kind of used it, the only way they used it, and Lucas talked about how the way it paid off in this film was that Darth Vader threatened Luke to, if you won't turn, maybe I'll get your sister. You have a twin sister. And so that is what motivated Luke to freak the fuck out and beat the shit out of Darth Vader and nearly kill him. Because they did say that when they were writing that scene, they couldn't figure out a motivation for what's his motivation for Luke to freak out like this and get the better of Darth Vader and almost go to the dark side. And then they realized, they came up with the idea of using the Leia. So, to me, but that's not enough to me to justify to having it. To me, it's not a big enough payoff to having, which is why I wanted to see more of a payoff in the sequel trilogy, which I will get to the sequel trilogy eventually. And I didn't get enough of it. To me, because she was a general, she didn't really become a Jedi, wasn't involved in the Force, and I was actually very disappointed by that. And so, just to talk very briefly about that one scene from The Last Jedi, which is a movie that is divisive to say the least. And in one scene that is almost universally hated and panned, when Leia uses like her force abilities to float back into the ship, which, you know, a lot of people joke she looks like Mary Poppins floating back in the ship. And I never mind that scene. I like that scene. I defended that scene. And the reason being is because we finally get to use the Force. And in fact, I remember arguing with someone about it. It's like, oh, this was foreshadowed before that she had these Force abilities. I'm like, but she's fucking Darth Vader's daughter. She's Luke's sister. It's very heavily implied that she's very heavily inherent in the Force, and yet we get zero payoff. This is the least they can do, in my opinion. But of course, you know, there's other issues with that scene in that movie, which I'll get to eventually. But I was just happy that they were finally paying off this plot point of Leia being Luke's sister, which I honestly don't think they ever really fully justified or made it noteworthy. They just needed an answer. They just needed to throw out an answer to that question that they threw out in Empire, and that's it. That's all it is. Yeah. Anyway. Anywho. So that's an issue I always had with this movie, to be honest. And then there's the structure of the film. It almost feels like several different stories. It starts off with the rescue of Han Solo on Tatooine, which, yeah, I know all the Star Wars movies seem to go from location to location, have different beats. Like in the A New Hope, it starts off in the Tatooine. They're looking for the droids. Luke is just a farmer. He has to be recruited by Obi-Wan, and then they leave Tatooine after Luke's uncle and aunt are murdered, and they're on the run from the Empire, and Luke, they're kind of lost, and Obi-Wan's kind of training him. Then they end up on the Death Star, and they have to try to escape, and then Obi-Wan dies, and they're dealing with the aftermath, and then they have to go on this huge attack to destroy the Death Star. So it's like there are different story beats, and it's the same thing with Empire as well. You got Hoth, and you got Cloud City, then you got Dagobah. But to me, those examples really flowed together, and it still, even though you got different set pieces, different aspects of the story, it still felt like one continuous story. Whereas here, the rescue of Han on Tatooine seems completely disconnected from the rest of the movie. It seems, again, it's an obligation that was set up at Empire Strikes Back, and so maybe I am being a bit too forgiving on The Empire Strikes Back because they weren't maybe looking forward to setting out the final movie exactly how, you know, it should have been. Because they set up the whole thing about Han being frozen Kyber because they weren't sure that Harrison Ford was going to return for a third film, so they wanted an out in case they had to replace him with Lando. But then, like, the studio execs and, of course, lots of cash convinced Harrison Ford to return. And so then they had to rescue Han from Jabba the Hutt, who had only been hinted at. Regardless of what these special editions show, he's not been seen before this point. And so that allowed them to, you know, come up with design for Jabba and do this whole thing at, you know, the whole sequence. And don't get me wrong, I don't like this. I mean, I don't hate this sequence overall. I did enjoy it. This definitely has that fun family aspect, adventure film aspect to it, that does make this sort of stand out as one of the classic 80s films. But if you look at it from, again, a logical perspective, Luke's plan here is really awful. It doesn't make any sense. So he's going to have Lando just chill out there disguised as a, you know, someone who works there. That makes sense. And then, but then he's going to have Leia is going to show up disguised as the bodyguard and just surrender Chewbacca into Jabba's custody. So now Jabba has Chewbacca as well as a hostage. That part wasn't really great. And then he would just surrender the droids to Jabba and have the droids working for him. How he didn't know Jabba wouldn't just destroy the droids immediately, I don't know. But anyway, and so once that worked, and then of course Leia wasn't careful enough and she went to free Han Solo, but then was caught quite too easily, in my opinion, by Jabba. I mean, shouldn't she like check that, because Jabba was just like sitting there on his little perch, like right behind the curtain. All he had to do was pull the curtain back and see them. Like, shouldn't she have checked to make sure that he wasn't actually there? But anyway, so Luke shows up. He does his Jedi mind trick to get in, but the Jedi mind trick doesn't work on Jabba, which I think he kind of should have known that it wouldn't have. And he tries to, attack them, and then is easily thrown into the Rancor pit, and he defeats the Rancor, but then he's like tied up, and everyone's hostage now, and they're taken out to the Sarlacc pit, and he somehow has like R2-D2 in place to, like, did he know they were going to be taken out to the Sarlacc pit? But anyway, maybe that's an improvised part of his plan, but ultimately it doesn't change the fact that his ultimate plan was sucked. It seemed like there would have been, and Lando being like under disguise is like a good idea, but they don't really do anything with it. He just all of a sudden, it's very obvious, and he helps them immediately when it comes time to. And then it's clear that he's not on their side. Like, it feels like he could have infiltrated like Jabba's people more and done more damage behind the scenes and done more to help them, rather than just instantly declaring, oh, he's on Luke's side and he's helping them, so they know exactly who he is now. But whatever. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but I really don't think it was a good plan. And how come so? Leia, I don't even know if I even want to talk about the Leia part of this whole sequence, because she was dressed up as like this badass bounty hunter, but Jabba has his men give her these clothes. I'm gonna just, for my sanity, assume that they gave her the clothes to change into, and he's like licking his lips in front of her, and like has her like on a chain in front of her, and this like really skimpy outfit. Like, this is something I've always went with, growing up as a kid and a teenager. I was like, oh yeah, whatever. But looking back on it now, of course, as an adult, I'm like, is this really necessary? Like, this does make me feel a little uncomfortable. Like, what is the deal? Like, why would they do this? Anyway. So, yeah. And let's talk about Boba Fett. Because, here's the thing. This is why I was never got really hugely excited about Boba Fett. Now, recently, the show, The Book of Boba Fett, came out, and everyone was like really excited. Oh my god, I can't wait. Boba Fett shows what I wanted my whole life. Finally get it. And then most people who had that attitude were completely disappointed by the show. I was like, oh, this is nothing like what I wanted. But I had zero expectation of that, because Boba Fett was always just a background character. And I think people built up this like non-existent like mythology in their own heads because of the toys that were sold or whatever. But on screen, he's just some dude in armor who just stood there and nodded. Like, he followed Han Solo, and Darth Vader was able to set the trap for him in Empire, and he just stood there and nodded, and here he's at Jabba, he stood there and nod. And he just promptly gets killed. And people like, some people will put down, oh, how could you just casually kill off such a great, villain like Boba Fett? But he wasn't. He was a background character. And what they did with him in this film kind of made sense for what they would do with a background character. There's the building him up as this great, amazing villain that's badass and awesome was something that was done completely in the minds of the fans' heads. Like, this is something completely fan-made. It's not on the screen at all, in my opinion. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, if there's obviously the design of the costume was good, that obviously inspired all this imagination, and if they want to explore something that is more of that fans have latched onto and created this whole mythology on their own, then that's all good. Like, I'm all for that. I'm all for doing a Boba Fett show, and more for exploring the character because of the, imaginings of the fans that created this. But what I didn't understand is people like, oh, this isn't the Boba Fett I know. I'm like, but you created. There is no Boba Fett you know. Like, on screen anyway. It's all in your head. Because on the screen, he's just some background character who stands there and nods and gets killed, which to me, that was totally natural that he would just fall in the thing. And they even play for comedy because Han Solo can't see, and Chewbacca's like, apparently tells him Boba Fett's there, and he's like, Boba Fett where? And when he's blind, he accidentally knocks Boba Fett over and he falls in the pit and dies. Which, with this mythological figure that fans created in their minds, they think is a really shitty thing to do, a shitty way for a character to die. But on screen, he was never really an important character to begin with, so to me it completely matches. So I actually have no issue with that whatsoever. And to be honest, like, no matter what they would have done in the Book of Boba Fett show, the character would not feel like Boba Fett. It would feel like a new character, regardless, because the actual character of Boba Fett was never fleshed out, never explored. There is no character of Boba Fett, in other words. So whatever you do with him in the prequels with Jango Fett or whatever, or in his own show in The Mandalorian, it's going to be a new character because there was never an existing one to begin with. Just a vague costume and vague concept of one. But anyway, that is my opinion of Boba Fett, and always has been. Anyway, so the overall, Jabba Rescue Palace, it has its flaws, especially if you think too much about it. But it's a fun action adventure 80s film. And so I think it serves its purpose in that regard, but is part of why it's not as great as Empire Strikes Back. Because I feel like the whole sequence that had more weight to it, it had more relevance for the overall film, where this was just like, oh, we have to resolve this Han Solo thing, so let's throw in this fun action adventure thing. Which, there's nothing wrong with it, but to me it makes the film unable to achieve the level of greatness that Empire had. Just in my humble opinion. So then we move over to the Yoda scene, which I said I would talk about. This again seemed really kind of inconsistent with Empire and kind of just thrown in there. Again, it makes sense knowing that this was Lucas's his one thing that he let Lawrence Kasdan have with the character die, but he wanted to have the theme of death as a normal part of life kind of thing. But it's a bit silly how, Luke shows up there and, Yoda's cooking food and he's just having a normal day, and then all of a sudden he just crawls in the bed and is like, okay, I'm going to die now. That just seemed really out of nowhere. And plus, at the end of Empire, he's like, oh, you have to come back. You have to complete your training. You shouldn't leave. I'm going to train you. And then all of a sudden, he's like, when Luke comes back, he's like, you don't need any more training. You're fine. I'm just going to die. To me, that's not the level of consistency. It doesn't have that. It's not a good follow-up to what Empire promised. But then again, we don't really need more flippy scenes with Yoda as a backpack on Luke's back. We got plenty of those in Empire, but still, it seemed that because Luke became a Jedi off-screen between these two movies, and it seemed like, shouldn't he have had Yoda's help for that? Wouldn't that have made more sense? I actually wouldn't have minded. I actually think it would have worked better had there been some off-screen allusion to Luke going back to Yoda and training. Although they make it clear here that Luke hadn't seen Yoda since the events of Empire. Because how did it become... he's much more skilled as a Jedi now. than he was in Empire. And so, how? How did that happen? Because for being off screen? So I actually think it would have worked better if there was this implied time that Luke spent with Yoda off screen between the two movies, and that's how he became a Jedi. And then, so it wasn't this, oh, I need to come back to complete my training, and Yoda's like, yeah, you don't need more training. Instead, they could come back and visit him again and be like, oh, I finished my training already, but I'm here to see you again. And Yoda's like, well, I'm about to die, whatever, because I finished training you, so my life, my time in this life is complete. That would have seemed to make a lot more sense. But anyway, I don't mean to sound arrogant by rewriting this movie, but I don't know. That just makes more sense to me. Yeah, so this whole thing I never really got it how he was just yeah. And then the Obi-Wan thing, when he appears as a Force Ghost to, a certain point of view, which is somewhat of the lamest excuse. Again, I feel it's kind of a rewrite. Now, there is a lot of evidence to imply that Lucas had always had the idea to make Darth Vader Luke's father, but I don't think this was taken into account, particularly by the studio, which was mostly involved in the first Star Wars film. In fact, because they didn't even know they were going to get another film at this stage. This could have been a crappy bomb for all they knew. And so it's very clear in the scene where Obi-Wan is explaining Luke's father to him, regardless of Lucas's original intention, it's very clear that scene was made in mind that Darth Vader was not Luke's father, and Luke's father was a separate person who was killed by Darth Vader. And so this again isn't they had to make excuses and backtrack, and Obi-Wan's like, whoa, well, in a way, Darth Vader did kill your father because the man I knew of, Anakin, died when he became Darth Vader, so what I said was actually true from a certain point of view. That was one of the lamest excuses in the universe. Out of the universe, it's less lame, but it's still obviously there just to explain, try to clean up the storyline there and explain why Obi-Wan had said that. Probably would have been better off if they had never mentioned it, but of course, that would have made sense in the story because Lucas had been told by Obi-Wan that his father was killed by Darth Vader. But anyway, so that scene with the whole scene with Obi-Wan there as a Force Ghost, that it's okay, but it always felt not right to me. I don't know. So the next part of the film is the part I find most boring. I find most skippable, and that's when Luke and Han and all them go to the Forest Moon of Endor. And they, have the speeder chase, and then Leia gets lost, and Chewie accidentally, puts on the Ewok trap, and then we meet the Ewoks, and then meanwhile, Lando's getting primed for his, space run, whatever. Now, let me talk a little bit about Lando, because this is, a clear-cut case of, well, we need a character to take control of this fleet, so what's the main character we have that's not really doing anything? Oh, we introduced this Lando character in the last movie. He was, introduced as this, scumbag gambler type who owns, a mining facility. He's gone kind of clean, he's kind of respectable, but he ends up betraying Han at the end, but then teams up with Leia to try to get Han back. And let's make him the freaking general in charge of a rebel space fleet. What? How does he go from, gambler, owner of a mining facility to commanding a whole rebel space fleet, being the commander, in charge, a general? That's ridiculous. It's obviously a case of, well, this is the main character we have, and we need a main character, and we want to have Han and Leia together with C-3PO and R2-D2 on the planet, and we want Luke to go off and have his own thing with Darth Vader and the Emperor, so the only main character left is Lando, guys. Let's just toss him in there. Anyway, and as for the indoor stuff, yeah, I don't know. First, maybe I enjoyed this more, especially the speeder scenes, because those are shot very well and they're exciting. I think part of the reason maybe why I find this the boringest part of the movie is because I've seen it so many times. And maybe when I first saw it, of course I know when I first saw it, I was a little kid, so I was very excited about all of that. Speaking of stuff aimed at little kids, let's talk about the Ewoks. Now, watching this film now from more of an analytical perspective and trying to analyze it, I do see the point of the Ewoks. Because it's funny because a lot of people criticize the Ewoks and talk about how ridiculous it is that, a band of indigenous teddy bears with bows and arrows and spears are able to fight off an advanced technological force, imposing like massive force like the Empire. But then recently there was an honest trailer that kind of fought back against this on the other side and said, oh yeah, this is so ridiculous that a technically inferior force with poor technology and less advanced civilizations able to defeat this more highly massive. And then they gave all these real life examples where that exact thing happened. They said Afghanistan twice, and they mentioned these other, I think this Vietnam was another one. They mentioned all these examples where a larger, more superior, and technologically way more advanced force is defeated by indigenous people. So you got me there. In fact, that kind of got me to change my mind. I was like, wait, now that you mention it. But then again, people from Afghanistan and Vietnam are not 5 foot tall teddy bears. Just saying. It adds a little bit more element of ridiculousness to it, but I can see the base argument there that, especially in their home territory, that indigenous people, even if their technology is way less advanced and less superior to that of their opponents, having that knowledge of the terrain in their home territory does. And I think that actually the movie, when I watch it with that lens, it does make sense, because at first the Ewoks are having a hard time, like they're trying to like use rocks and spears, and it's not really working against the Empire's technology, but they quickly learn how to use it. Like they tried to like wrap this rope around those, the Imperial Walker things, and to make it trip, and it doesn't work. But then later they figure out other ways, like they throw a whole bunch of logs at it instead. And so the Walker thing that's one of my favorite things. I loved it as a kid. I used to think it was hilarious. And even now as an adult, I still love it. It's one of my favorite scenes is when the Ewoks toss all those logs at the Imperial Walker and it goes and falls over. I think that's really cool. But and then how they have the two logs swing at the same time from either side and just smash the Imperial Walker, like stuff like it shows. And this of course happens at really lightning speed, because actual battles take place, wars like this will take place every year, but this happens all in a matter of like several hours. But whatever, it still shows the progression of how they're learning to use what they have, and of course being familiar with the forest and the territory does help them tremendously. So okay, I will buy that, but the fact that they're 5 foot tall teddy bears is me again. But anyway, so I've grown to appreciate the Ewoks more because of that. But I still think there are a lot of moments with the Ewoks that are meant to be funny and appeal more to kids that I don't care for anymore as an adult. I'm sure I loved it when I was 4 years old when this movie came out. But as a 43-year-old, I don't really care about Wicket, or what's his name, whatever his name is, meeting Leia and being all silly and eating the candy bar or whatever that was, and freaking you seeing like in the middle of this battle, seeing Ewok like hit himself in the head with the spinning rock they were supposed to throw at the stormtroopers. Like, I think that's stupid. I don't think it's funny. So overall, I'm tolerant of the Ewoks. Like, they're fine. It's obvious because I like the point of what they're saying with indigenous people and having an indigenous force help, Luke and the rebels. But of course, they have to be fuzzy, cute-looking teddy bears in order to sell toys and get kids on board. And so that aspect I'm less okay with or less on board with. But to be perfectly clear, the Ewoks are not nearly as bad as Jar Jar Binks, and that's something I'm going to cover next year. But I remember when there was a huge backlash against Jar Jar Binks and when Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones came out, and people were thinking that Jar Jar Binks was the worst thing that ever happened to Star Wars. The counter response to that would be like, well, and this is kind of George Lucas's own response, would be like, well, in the original trilogy we had, silly humor meant for kids as well, like the Ewoks. And a lot of people would be like, well, Star Wars has always done stuff like this, like the Ewoks. And people used to hate the Ewoks, and people used to hate R2-D2 and complain that it was too childish and silly back then, but now they love it, but now they're, doing the same thing with Jar Jar Binks. I will definitively say no. That is not true. Jar Jar Binks is objectively worse than the Ewoks in every way, shape, and form. He, like I said, the Ewoks have been made, they act silly sometimes, and they, do stuff like hit themselves with the rock, and they look like cute teddy bears. But they also have that other side of them where it actually and they actually, for the language that they speak, they actually took a combination of, they based it off of many different tribal languages in Africa, which, and maybe some other countries too, which I find, I know Africa's, I mean countries outside of Africa. I'm not saying Africa's a country, alright? But countries like Indonesia and stuff like that, I think they might have had that as inspiring as it. But anyway, so it gives this authentic feel to it as indigenous people that you respect, and you respect that they're able to defeat the Empire, and that they see the wisdom of teaming up with Luke, Han, and Leia, and that Luke, Han, and Leia had to earn their respect. Of course, they do this by tricking them, by making them think C-3PO is a god, which maybe is not the best way to go about it, but they do earn their respect more after that when, they tell their story and they're like, we're now part of the tribe. Like, looking at that with an adult analytical perspective, I actually really appreciate that scene. I actually like it much more that they have this fighting force of this indigenous peoples to work with. But so that has the Ewoks, even though they're silly teddy bears that obviously meant to sell toys and they can be childish and there to appeal to children, they have that other aspect to them that makes a lot of sense for the story and has some real life implications, whereas Jar Jar Binks does not have that other element to it. He's just a silly, stupid cartoon character, like done with bad CGI, who looks like he's a cartoon, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit type situation in a live action situation, who's acting like a silly, dumb cartoon character who's just thrown into Star Wars. It is objectively different, objectively worse than anything the original trilogy did, and plus his jokes were more frequent, more childish, way more annoying, and so don't even try to make that comparison. That comparison falls apart in every way, shape, or form. Okay, even on myself, I got a little tricked about this when it when it had been years since I've seen Return of the Jedi. That, okay, maybe they got a point. Maybe the Ewoks were just as bad as Jar Jar. No, they were not. Nowhere near. Anyway, so for me, what makes this film so great, definitely the best part of the film is the scenes with Luke going to Darth Vader. And it's very interesting because I remember not liking this all that much when I was a kid, because when I was a kid I came to see, like, fighting in action, and there was this, adult sitting around talking about their feelings. Like, I'm not here to see a action blockbuster. That's not what I want out of my sci-fi space fantasy adventure. But, of course, as an adult, I appreciate it way more, and it's in fact my favorite aspect of the movie. And it's definitely a pivot. And I think it did throw a lot of people off when it first came out, which is why this movie wasn't looked on. It was a lukewarm reception when this movie first came out. I will say it's a fact that this movie is way more beloved now than it was when it first came out, and a lot of that had to do with nostalgia, and the people who saw this were kids who are now adults that love it, were kids at the time this came out, and that kind of thing. That's definitely part of it, but you could argue a lot more part of it is that it's unexpected, and this was not the direction people were expecting this fantasy adventure to go in. To have, you think it would be the good guy wins against evil. And that's why I love it now. That's why I love it as an adult. That's what makes me appreciate it, that they did not simply go in that direction. Apparently, that's another thing Lawrence Kasdan was kind of pushing Lucas to go, is to have, he wanted Luke Skywalker to kill Darth Vader and the Emperor, and have good defeat evil. And I'm so glad they actually didn't go that way. I think it's a lot more complex, it's a lot more emotional, and it's a lot more realistic to have Darth Vader trying to turn Luke to the dark side, but at the same time you have Luke trying to turn his father back to the light side. And I think, after seeing the Clone Wars, more so than the prequels, really fleshed out Anakin's character, and so the prequels, I think, did a terrible job at that, but I'll talk about more, because they were more too concerned with trying to foreshadow his turn to the dark side, where they didn't do enough to say, hey, this is he was a good person, he was a great Jedi. And I think the Clone Wars, the show, does a much better job at that. So much so where the two Anakins don't even seem like the same character. And I think the Clone Wars version is way better. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here. Having that back knowledge now makes this even more powerful, that Luke is connecting with that good person. Of course, even without saying that, even when this movie first came out in 1983, you still understood the concept that his father used to be a Jedi, used to be a good person, and had went astray, and Luke is trying to pull him back. And of course, that would be a nearly impossible task to accomplish. And I think Luke, in fact, does overestimate his chances of getting his father to turn. But I have a feeling, and some of that might be wishful thinking of wanting to have a father, but part of it could be, since he is a Jedi, that he maybe does, in fact, sense some good in Darth Vader, and maybe he's exaggerating it, and it's a lot smaller and buried deeper than he is willing to admit, but it's definitely there, and he's latching on to that. But of course it does work in the end, because when Darth Vader sees that Luke did what he could not, he refused to be turned to the dark side. And I think that more than anything shaped, and we'll call him Anakin now, it shaped Anakin's blind devotion that nothing is more powerful than the dark side. And that's a belief that he had gotten through the years from his personal experience of having turned to the dark side himself and done really horrible things for many years. And seeing his own son able to stand up and refuse the Emperor flat out, and then the Emperor responds by just killing him, I think that made him realize his mistakes and that the dark side was not as powerful as he thought. And of course he couldn't let his son be killed, and decides to kill the Emperor at the cost of his own life. And I think that's a very, very powerful ending. It's an extremely powerful ending. And more from a campy point of view, there's a lot of like cool lines throughout this whole sequence that I always used to quote when I was a teenager and stuff, like when the Emperor says, "And now, young Skywalker, you will die." I used to love saying that. Or and this is something like when I had dogs that would like beg for my food and they're just staring at me while I'm eating, I would always say to them, "You want this, don't you?" Stuff like that. God, the Emperor is a bit campy in here, but in a good way. I think in the best way possible. It doesn't undermine the seriousness of the storyline, and so now I look at it as definitely the film's high point. And I will say, I think the whole sort of last 45 minutes, half hour of the film really works for me. I think it is definitely a high point. Like, all of the storylines. In fact, I love the way they're edited together. Now, I do think it's ridiculous that Lando's in charge of the fleet, but I still love the, sequences. I think they're really good battle sequences with the, them trying to destroy the Death Star. Now, I'm going to fight back against something, a criticism I've heard, because and I just watched the pitch meeting for this. If you've seen the pitch meeting videos on YouTube, they're hilarious. And then not just the pitch meetings, a lot of people brought this up. They're like, "Oh, we're going to build another Death Star. Oh, we're going to get rid of that little port that was able to have that weak spot that just destroys the whole thing. Oh yeah, we got rid of that, and now we just have an open corridor where ships can just fly right in and destroy the reactor." But I'm going to fight back against that. Because this new Death Star had a fucking impenetrable shield. Now granted, maybe it could have had a backup in case, but the first Death Star did not have a shield around it. Ships could just fly up because this is invincible. Here they're willing to admit, okay, the Death Star, if it's unprotected, it's vulnerable, so we're going to put this impenetrable shield and the Emperor basically won, practically. Like, he was so convinced he would win because he rightfully had a lot of troops there to protect the shield generator on the surface to ensure that the shield didn't go down. And guess what? If that shield didn't go down, that Death Star does not get destroyed. So I'm going to fight back against that this Death Star was constructed even more poorly than the first because they thought of the shield. Anyway, that's just my perspective. But yeah, I got to talk about, of course, Admiral Akbar. I have to say, I don't know why his line, "It's a trap," has become such a cultural phenomenon. Or when the Death Star comes on an operation, he says, our ships can't deflect weapons of that magnitude. I love the skit they did with the Admiral Akbar serial where he's like, "Your tongues can't deflect flavor of that magnitude." I don't know. Anyway, oh God, I love Admiral Akbar. He should have been the admiral in charge of Lost Jedi, not Purple Hair Lady. But yeah, I'll get to that eventually. Anyway, so it was funny seeing a young Akbar in Clone Wars. That was a bit silly. But anyway, So yeah, as much as silly as I think it is that they put Lando and a bunch of side characters in charge of this whole space battle, I think it would have made more sense to have some main characters in there that actually made sense to be there. It was still exciting, and I still loved the way it was edited, the way it contributed to the back and forth of, the way Lando kept saying, Han's gonna get this shield time, we gotta give him some more time! Or he'd be like, come on, Han, old buddy, don't let me down! And then finally, when the shield comes down, it's like, I knew he'd do it! Anyway, so yeah, I think all of that works for me, and I like how that's intercut between that and the Luke stuff and the Endor stuff, which again, this all really works for me. That having, even though the Ewoks are a bit silly, having an indigenous force team up with Han and Leia to defeat it, and I love how Chewie teams up with two Ewoks to take over one of the Imperial Walkers, and that's ultimately how they get into the base to take the shields down, which I actually love that. I think that's really interesting that Chewie goes off on his own, and seeing him, of course, interact with two Ewoks is fun for the kids, but I still think it works. Although his Tarzan scream makes no fucking sense whatsoever. And they try to make that, they have the Wookiees doing that in Revenge of the Sith to try to say, oh no, this has nothing to do with Tarzan, it's just a thing Wookiees do. It was out of universe, in the universe it doesn't make any sense because it's supposed to be in a galaxy far, far away a long, long time ago, so how are they referencing Tarzan? But obviously it was done for modern audiences. So, but that part bothers me. But other than that, yeah, I really actually love the end half of the final half of this movie. It really works for me. It's really well done. The editing and everything comes together brilliantly. So I gotta give total props for that. One thing I will criticize though is not the fact that that new Death Star was flawed. The fact that we're doing a Death Star again. That is kind of lazy. And I think it does. There is elements to this movie that does feel kind of like nowhere near to the degree of, say, Game of Thrones season 8, but it feels like like Lucas and the creators were just a bit tired and just wanted to get it over with. Now, obviously, I mean that to a very small extent because for the most part, this movie is brilliant and it works. But there's elements like that, like the Death Star, I think is the worst example because that's just a lazy, we gotta have a space battle. What we're gonna do? Well, let's just throw this main character, Lando, I guess, and we'll have him attack another Death Star. I guess. I don't know. That worked. It's popular enough in the first film, so let's do it again. Let's just do the Death Star over again. Well, haven't we done this? Isn't it going to be repetitive? Who cares? I'm too lazy to think of something else. Let's just do another Death Star. And, I gotta state the obvious that this, of course, is nowhere near as bad as what they did with Starkiller Base in Force Awakens, but I'll get to that later. That's obviously much worse. But it's still bad enough that there. And the other thing where it feels kind of lazy is the Harrison Ford's performance. He obviously didn't really want to do this movie. He had to be talked back into it, and he didn't really put all that much effort into it, and you can really tell that with his acting. And they have that scene where Luke tells Leia that he's her brother, and the scene between them is okay. It's a bit badly written and the whole concept is dumb, but then the scene after when Han comes in and it's like, who you're not going to tell me? Can you tell Luke? Is that who you can tell? That's a very bad scene. It's poorly written, poorly acted. I think everything about that scene sucks, my opinion. Anyway, so those are just aspects of where I think lazy writing can come in. Now, but the ending, of course, I think is really great. How they they win, and you have a really happy ending. And I actually agree with Lucas that this is what the trilogy needed. It needed a really uplifting, happy ending, and they couldn't end it on more of a dire note like they did with Empire. It makes sense for the second part of the trilogy to end that way, but I think you couldn't end this one this way. However, just because the Emperor is dead, does that mean like the Empire automatically falls? That's usually not how it works. I mean, sometimes it works that way. But sometimes there are other people who take their place. And I suppose this is what these novels try to address. And maybe a proper 7, 8, and 9, which we never actually got. And I'll get into how 7, 8, and 9 don't actually work because they're just, let's just do the Empire over again. But I'll get to that later. It might be addressed a little bit in the shows, which take place directly after Return of the Jedi, The Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, and maybe I think the Ahsoka show is going to as well, so maybe they'll address this. We get characters like Moff Gideon, who are kind of like the after effects of the Empire. So, so they are addressing it a little bit, but it does seem like this happy ending in this movie isn't entirely earned. Like, I don't think just because you destroyed the Death Star and Darth Vader and the Emperor are dead, I mean, maybe the Empire is no more, and maybe the new Republic will be formed, but it's not going to be that easy. It's going to be a very tough and difficult transition. But hey, let's all party and forget about that right now. That's all good. Alright, now I think I've been avoiding this, but let me address the special editions, because I would love to watch the original versions of these films, but I can't really get access to them or whatever. And so I'm just lazy. I just watch what's on Disney Plus, and Disney Plus has the special editions, which, as far as Lucas is concerned, is the only definitive version of Star Wars, which is why he went out of his way to try to wipe out all the other versions. Which is, I'm not one of those fans who nitpick every little thing about it, like Han shot first. I don't really care about most of the changes that they made. Like, in fact, in this, they added a couple extra no's when Darth Vader is seeing the Emperor kill Luke, and he goes, no, and then picks up the Emperor. Like, that was added. And I didn't even realize that. Actually, that kind of works for me. I don't mind that at all. What bothers me is they took out the Nub Nub song. Like, why would you do that? I remember that song was playing on the radio when I was a kid. It was a very popular num num na num na num na, and it just added some generic music in there instead. I'm like, I think they did that because they wanted to add in sequences of the other worlds celebrating the Emperor's death, and it wouldn't really work with a nub nub song, but I did actually like how they added the other worlds, though. Some people were making fun of that. Oh, they put Gungans when they have a Gungan standing in Naboo going, "We's are free," which I didn't even notice, of course, until much later. But I didn't mind that. Like, I actually liked that from after watching the Clone Wars perspective, actually makes a lot of sense that you would see these different worlds and how they react to the fall of the Emperor. So I kind of like that. And the other thing I will staunchly defend is using Hayden Christensen's image as Anakin, as the Force Ghost of Anakin. I've heard some people complain about that and saying it doesn't make any sense, but I think it makes way more sense than having the old crusty guy, because that's the old guy is Darth Vader. That's not Anakin. This is Anakin. Anakin was the person he was before he turned to the dark side, and this is what he looked like before he turned to the dark side. That old crusty fat guy, that's Darth Vader. And this was pretty much Lucas's reasoning as well, as saying, well, no, he goes back to the Anakin that he was when he was a good Jedi, and that's why he looks like Hayden Christensen. I totally agree. I'll fight anyone on that. I think this makes way more sense. And also, I also like how it links back to the prequel. So I am a staunch defender of that aspect of it. So anyway, my rating for The Return of the Jedi out of 10, I'm going to give this an 8. Extremely good. Which I was going back and forth in my mind whether I should give this an 8 or a 9, but the more I talked about some of its flaws, such as, let's just start another Death Star, let's just start another Orlando in charge just because he's the main character, and let's have this sequence of them rescuing Han even though it has nothing to do with anything else, and then the middle thing is boring, and let's have these stupid jokes with the Ewoks, and some of the sloppy thing like, Leia's Luke's sister because of whatever. I can't really give it a 9 with all those considerations, but people are gonna call me inconsistent now because I said this. I like this movie better than Revenge of the Sith and The Last Jedi, both of which I gave 9s to. So I don't know. I don't know what to tell you about that. I'll see. Maybe I'll still give them 9s. I don't know. I just like the original trilogy better, I would say. But I don't care. I'm sticking with my 8 for this because I do love it, though. I definitely like it more than A New Hope. It is definitely... I love particularly... I think the last 45 minutes really saved the film. And I love the way all 3 sequences, the space battle, Battle of Endor, and Luke's inner battle with his father, how they all intercut and play together. It's really amazing. Really good stuff. And I think it's just great filmmaking. Of course, the first half of the film, maybe not as good. And having Yoda die for no reason because they're too lazy. Like, that's another bad thing. But still, great way to end the trilogy. And, of course, the Luke storyline with finding redemption as father. Very powerful, very complex, amazing, good story writing. So they didn't reach a 10, they didn't reach a 9, but definitely an 8 at the very least, a very strong 8. So that's it for my review of The Return of the Jedi. Thanks so much for watching this. I shall be back next, May the 4th, to cover the next Star Wars film that came out in chronological order, The Phantom Menace. Oh boy, can't wait for that. In the meantime, you can check out, I have lots of other Star Wars coverage on my channel at the moment. I just finished covering every episode of Star Wars Clone Wars, one season at a time, as well as doing top 10 favorite and least favorite episodes, where actually it was more like top 30, but something like that. Least favorite and least favorite episodes of the Clone Wars. And then pretty soon I'm going to be starting my coverage of Star Wars Rebels, which I will also review every episode one season at a time. And of course I'll do cover other newer Star Wars stuff like Obi-Wan. So I'll be definitely doing at least one review for that. So lots of Star Wars stuff on my channel coming up, but of course I also cover many other shows, mainly Star Trek, doing lots of retro Star Trek reviews and covering the newer Star Trek shows as well, such as Strange New Worlds, which I'm really excited for, and other shows like The Expanse. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.